Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of model lessons from the Quran. We'll be studying a Quranic passage, and the passage today which I have selected is from Surah Mu'minun. In fact, these are the first 11 verses of this surah, and as has been the case previously, the passage selected and the verses selected are relate to our moral development and ethical upbringing. So I'm just going to first read out the text of this passage before you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Qad aflahal mu'minun allazina hum fi salatihim khashi'un wallazina hum 'anil laghwi mu'ridun wallazina hum liz-zakati fa'ilun wallazina hum li furujihim hafizun illa 'ala azwajihim aw ma malakat aymanuhum fa innahum ghayru malumin. فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون والذين هم لأماناتهم وعهدهم راعون والذين هم على صلواتهم يحافظون أولئك هم الوارثون الذين يرثون الفردوس هم فيها خالدون. So these 11 verses, as you can see, are the opening verses of Surah Mu'minun, and their translation is: in the name of God, the most gracious, the ever merciful. Those believers succeeded who showed humility in their prayer, who desist from frivolity, and who pay zakah, and who guard their private parts except for their wives and slave maidens. So in their case, there is no blame on them. However, those who desire others besides them, it is they who exceed the limits. And those who give due regard to their trusts and to their promises, and those who guard their prayers. It is these people who will be the inheritors, who are the inheritors of Firdaus. They shall abide in it forever. So as you can see, these verses actually begin with this declaration, and the very first word is, or the very first verse is, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. So you can see that the first sentence is in the past tense. This is generally the style of the Quran whenever some future event is so certain to come that it is actually depicted in the past tense. So, of course, when the verse says that believers have succeeded, it means that they will succeed in the hereafter. But this is a very special style of the Quran in which future events which are certain to happen, they are depicted or mentioned in the past tense, signifying that they are so certain to happen as if they have already happened. So the passage starts off with this first verse that believers, or those believers who have succeeded, and then subsequently the traits of these believers who have succeeded, or towards which the verse says that they have succeeded, are pointed out. So the first trait which is mentioned is allazina hum fi salatihim khashirun. This actually means that they are extremely humble in their prayer. They know that they are praying before someone who is the greatest of all, and their own status before him is nothing. So the verses start off with the acknowledgement of this humility, and this humility is actually something which is found in their prayers when they stand up before the Almighty, when they prostrate before Him. The overwhelming feeling that they are His creatures, they are so insignificant before Him, and at the same time they are ones who are going to succeed if they are so humble in their prayers. Humility in one's prayer actually means that we are standing before God in all awe and in His respect, and we revere Him, we respect Him, and we do show that this respect and this reverence is because of the fact that we acknowledge our position in this universe as people who are, as creatures who have been created by Him, creatures who might be blessed by Him with a number of traits, with a number of attributes, with a number of qualities, but it is basically God's blessing, and whenever He wants, He can take them away. And when we stand in prayer and we show this humility, we actually express this fact that every blessing that we have is from Him. And in all honesty, we might not have earned it, but we do profess this, or we do try to make this point that once that we have been given these favors, we will, inshallah, try to dispense with them in the best possible way. So this is the very first verse which tells us that what makes believers succeed in the hereafter. And then the next words are وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ, which means that they desist from any frivolity. You see, love is the word which means that things which are absolutely baseless, things which indulgence in such things which will just make a mockery out of a person's humanity. Thus, for example, indulging in loose talk or starting to swear in things that is generally the case when we are not very vigilant about our conversation, or indulging in such trivial things which might include as belittling other people or engaging ourselves in certain areas that is absolutely below the dignity of a person. So the second trait which is mentioned is وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ, they just desist from any frivolity. And then the verses go on to say, well, after that, it says that وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, that these are the believers who are very, very attentive in their zakat, who do not show any negligence in paying zakat. And this is, of course, something which is a very stark reminder, my dear participants, especially in this month of Ramadan, when generally people dispense with their zakat. One thing which is very important in this regard is that at times we are not very, very careful in calculating the amount of zakat which is due upon us. And the Quran says that this is extremely important, that we must calculate the zakat that is due on us. And we might be paying more than the zakat, because zakat is something of an obligation. But then we have to have an account of the fact that how much more we are paying, so that at times we might not even realize that we might be paying less than actually what is due upon us. So another trait which is mentioned here is وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, that they are ones who are very vigilant in paying their zakat. They calculate their zakat and they think that this zakat is obligation they owe to the Almighty, and it's in fact an obligation to the society in which they live. And of course, people who are deprived, people who are needy, they are the ones whom the state is going to take care of through the money, which is zakat money, which is given to the public Baitul Mal or the public treasury. That is why zakat is the only tax which is actually necessarily implemented or imposed on Muslim citizens, because it is through this payment that the state collects the funds and then dispenses it for the well-being of its citizens. So it is extremely important that we do realize that zakat is incumbent upon us. We should not be slack upon in calculating it, and just not give it out of a rough estimation, because this is something which might, as I said, be something which might we not even realize that perhaps because of inflation and because of so many factors, we might virtually end up paying less than what is actually due upon us. And then the next verses say, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ. So they are the ones who protect their private parts except for their wives and slave maidens. So in their case, there is no blame on them. So this verse, this surah, as you know, was revealed in the times of the Prophet, in an era in which slavery was rampant. And this slavery was actually inherited by Islam. It never condoned it. It never encouraged it. In fact, it went upon a whole campaign of eradicating slavery. And the first directive of eradicating new slaves was when wars were to be fought. And of course, we know the first major war which was fought between Muslims and the idolaters was the Battle of Badr. So right at that time, the Almighty revealed in Surah Muhammad and said that you just cannot capture prisoners of wars and make them slaves. So you see, one of the greatest sources of slavery was that people would be captured as prisoners and they would be converted into slaves. So the Quran actually embarked upon a two-pronged strategy to eliminate slavery. First, it actually shut the doors towards making new slaves. And this it did by making this incumbent upon Muslims that if they capture any prisoners of war, they cannot be made slaves. In fact, the words of the Quran are that they have to be set free, either through ransom or without ransom. And now the Quran was actually left to deal with slaves which were already in houses, and there were scores of them. So it started a gradual campaign of eradicating this slavery. However, during this interim period in which slavery was kept intact, of course, sexual relations with the slave maidens, which already continue to exist and since previous times, they were allowed, and with wives as well. So the verse is actually making this point that believers are those who do not indulge in extramarital relations. In those times, slave maidens were not considered to be extramarital relations. In fact, they were not even considered to be a married entity. So therefore, this was something which the Quran allowed only in that interim period in which slavery was tolerated for a few years. And we know that later on, when a point-blank directive was revealed in Surah Nur, which said that you have to set free any slave who wanted himself or herself to be set free, if it gave this guarantee through a certain piece of amount of money, that it would not become, or he or she would not become, a burden on the society. So that is what we call the verse of Muqatibat. It was revealed near the end of the Prophet's life, but during that time, slavery was given that protection, so that because of the fact it was so deeply ingrained in the Arab society that a single order of its eradication or its emancipation of slaves would have resulted in a lot of problems, because most slave ladies and slave maidens were not morally sound, and it would have resulted in they going out in the society and opening up prostitution dens, and men who were slaves would have just turned to beggary in order to earn for themselves. So in order to circumvent all these untoward circumstances, the Quran actually adopted a gradual strategy of eliminating slavery. So today, of course, there are no slaves. In fact, in the times of the Prophet himself, and that final directive was revealed, slavery was totally abolished. And it was during this period that, as I said earlier on, that sexual relations with your slave maidens were allowed. And in principle, what this verse is speaking about is the fact that extramarital relations or relations outside of wedlock are certainly not allowed, and people who indulge in such relations, and as the verse says, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ, they are people who are indulging in it. If they do so, then they would be committing an excess. So the Quranic words are فَمَنِ ابْتَغَىٰ وَرَاءَ ذَٰلِكَ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ. And then we have the next verse which says وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَأَحْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. So they are the ones who give due regard to their trusts and to their promises. So whatever is entrusted to their custody, whatever they are entrusted with, they don't show any dishonesty or embezzlement in that, and they are extremely honest in them. And it also says, the other thing it says is that they are very, very punctual and very vigilant regarding the promises that they make. So, ala ahdihim ra'un. And this is something which we have to realize, my dear participants, that whenever we speak something, it's not just necessary that we give our word or we give an oath. It's just saying something which makes us committed to the other person. So we have to be very careful, because at times exaggeration, overstatements, understatements, making commitments and promises which we know right at the time that we are making them that we would not be able to honor them is something that we must never do. And whenever we have to make a promise, it should be a realistic one in which we have a fair amount of certainty that we would be able to fulfill it. And if at all, because of some untoward circumstances, or maybe because of some emergency situations, we are not able to honor it, then we have to apologize. And if there are any damages as a result, we must pay them as well. But in the first place, we must try to honor every promise that we have. And this promise, or these promises that this verse refers to, are a host of promises. They're not just promises which are made by the tongue. There are a lot of promises which are understood. For example, the relationship that we have with our parents, or the relationship that we have with our God, is again something of an unwritten promise. So the Sharia itself is called misaq, or a covenant. So when we follow our religion, we are actually honoring that covenant. We are actually honoring our promise. Similarly, a lot of rights and duties which might not be written, or which we might not have undertaken as a verbal commitment, but they are there, like being good citizens of a state, like being good students of a teacher, like, for example, being good children of our parents. So all these are unwritten promises that we make, and whether they are unwritten, understood, or written, we have to honor these promises. And then, as we end the passage and we near the end of the passage, we find that once again the prayer is stressed, and it says, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَىٰ صَلَوَاتِهِمْ يُحَافِظُونَ. So they are the ones who guard their prayers. And this is a very common phenomenon of the Quran, in which things which are of utmost importance, the Quran begins with their mention, and it ends with their mention as well. So it began. You remember when we started off these verses, this passage, it said, "Allazina hum fi salatihim khashiyun," that these believers who have succeeded are the ones who show humility in their prayer. Now, the passage ends exactly on the prayer, but with one significant addition. It says that these are the believers who guard their prayers, who are very, very protective of their prayers, which of course mean that they pray on time. They are always vigilant that time is of essence, and they must not be in a position that they end up thinking, well, the time of the prayer has passed. And at the same time, offering the prayer in a way that is extremely calm, and we are not in a hurry. That is also part of protecting the prayer. So when the Quran says, "Allah salawatihim yuhafizun," it also means that the prayer is offered in a very dignified, in a very calm, in a composed way. We are able to understand what we are saying, and when we are standing before our Lord, we have all our attention focused before Him, and instead of thinking about all kinds of things, we try our best to think that we are standing before the Lord of the heavens and the earth. So this is equally important. And then the passage finishes by saying that it is these people who will end up in Firdaus, which are the gardens of paradise, and they shall abide in it forever. Hum fiha khalidun. So you can see qad aflaha al-mu'minun. Again, it's it's a parallel to what we can see in the later part of the passage as well. Hum fiha khalidun. That this success which is mentioned in the very first verse actually refers to the fact that if believers follow these traits, if they exhibit these traits, then they will end up in paradise, and they shall abide in it forever. And abiding in paradise forever is something which, of course, is the real success which the passage spoke of when it actually started. So with these words, I would now end my talk here, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. We have Fatma. Fatma, could you go with your question?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
My question is that I've heard this hadith कि दो चीजें I've heard this hadith कि दो चीजें तकदीर बदल सकती हैं, एक सदका और दूसरा दुआ. What is the reality of this hadith?
I don't think there's such any authenticity in this hadith. It's just more of hearsay. Sadqa or dua, they have their own place, but whatever has been ordained by the Almighty is, of course, well thought of. And obviously, we do understand that there are things which depend on our supplication. But the definitive tone which this hadith carries, that every time we spend in charity, or maybe we put up our hands in supplication, then whatever has been ordained for us is going to change. That is not warranted by the Quran. At best, what can be said is that, of course, if we pray to the Almighty, if we supplicate before Him, the best thing that can happen is that if whatever is ordained for us and our own supplication is in line with the wisdom and justice of the Almighty, you might, consider our prayer. But to think that these are the two things which are going to definitely ward off whatever lies in store for us would not be correct in the light of the Quran.
Thank you, Fatma. Muhammad Asif Gumra, you can ask the question now.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Dr. My question is that translation you're using it, which author you use for the translation, and any preference, the reason for using that particular author?
If you're talking about the English translation,
yes.
Well, I generally use the translation of N.J. Dawood, which is one of the best translations. But again, I also use my own translation of my teacher's translation of the Quran. So both of these translations I copiously consult.
So first one was
it's called the Quran translated by N.J. Dawood.
N.J.
So
Dawood.
he's an Iraqi convert, or some people think that he didn't even convert because he was a Jew, but his understanding of the Quran and the Arabic and the English language is immaculate.
Dr. Suhail Anwar, you can go now.
Dr. Saleem, thank you very much for another excellent talk. My question is, this issue of slavery in Islam that you've alluded to obviously is very, very problematic. It's one of the biggest objections that raised by anti-Quranist, Orientalist, and anti-Islamic people is about the question of slavery. Now, I'm fully aware of the Farahi's stand on this, that slavery was gradually abolished. And if one pushes one's imagination, one can see it from a certain perspective. But still, there are quite a lot of questions, and I'll just posit a couple of things in front of you. And, if time permits, then I'll come back to it. First thing is, please correct me wrong. Quran has never categorically prohibited slavery. If my, please do correct me if I'm wrong there, which obviously poses a problem. Second thing is, and I'll just stop after the two. Second thing is, yes, it is true that slavery was well established before Islam even came in, and it was right, possibly, to abolish it gradually. But why did we have to allow sex with a slave woman? Why couldn't the Quran just say, okay, don't kick your slaves out, still be their patron, still look after them, but sex is clearly prohibited. You can keep the slave woman in your house, but you're not allowed to have sex with them, because the only people you can have sex with is your wives. And it wasn't like one person had one wife at that time. They had multiple. So there wasn't really any need to continue having sex with a slave woman as well. So those are the kind of things we see all over the anti-Islamic websites.
Well, as far as your first question is concerned, it all depends by what you mean as categorical prohibition. I just refer to the fact that there were two ways in which the Quran prohibited. First was that it categorically said that no new slaves can be made. So you see, one categorical prohibition was that as soon as wars ensued, which was, we know that the first war was the Battle of Badr, so the Quran stopped immediately in a very categorical way that no new slave can be inducted. So I think this is a huge contribution of religion, because as far as previous slaves are concerned, that's another issue. I'm just going to come to that. But it stopped categorically the induction of any new slaves. Now, as far as the slaves which were already in the houses of people, and there were scores of them, there were a number of issues, because there were all kinds of people, young, old, women who were very old, men who were very old, and at the same time, women who were not very morally sound. So had the question been of what you have just referred to, that sex should have been stopped between their masters and themselves, then the question does arise is that, yes, well, this could have been the case in the case of their masters, but what about the slave ladies themselves? Sexual desire is something which they as well needed. So if this would have been stopped, where would have they gone? So they also needed to satisfy their sexual urge. So what happens is that we tend to view a situation from one angle only. So I think there are both angles. If it had been stopped, of course, the masters had their wives available for them. But as I said, they had no place to go. So the Quran did not even touch that, and it kept it intact. And as far as that categorical emancipation directive was concerned, it did come, and it did come at the very end of the Prophet's ministry, when every single slave was told that, yes, if you want, you can just now set yourselves free, as long as you give that guarantee that you're not going to be morally corrupt or become a burden on the society. So I think this was perhaps the best possible strategy, that on the one hand, every new slave that could have been made was immediately stopped. This was not a possibility, because as I just mentioned, that the greatest source for new slaves was these wars. And people who would be free, they would be made slaves. So that was a categorical prohibition. And the second categorical prohibition was regarding current slaves which were already present. And that came after a gradual period of time, because, as I said, it was so deeply ingrained in the society that it had to take some time. And regarding the question of intimacy, I just refer to the fact that we have to view it from both angles. Women also need the same thing. And anything which would have deprived them of this would have resulted maybe in a greater chaos.
In which case, Dr. Saleem, please correct me if I'm wrong again. I think it's 424. and 423 and 424, where we are given a list of people that we can and can't have sex with. I think it's in 424 where it says that you're allowed to have sex with women, even married women who are captured as slaves from wars. Is that correct? I think it's so. So where does that fit in the picture that you have just described? If they are then allowed to capture women who are
They
not
have to be
only
set free. You see, they can only be kept as they cannot be kept as slaves at all. You just cannot capture any person, whether man or woman, or make them slave. This is what Surah Muhammad, which is a Meccan surah. 424 is a Medinan surah. So Surah Nisa is a Medinan surah, the one that you're referring to. That has an entirely different meaning. It was in Mecca. I mean, it was in Surah Muhammad, where immediately at the time of the Battle of Badr, which was ensuing, that this whole practice was stopped. I'm sorry, it's not a Meccan surah, it's also a Medinan surah, but it's a very early Medinan surah.
Are you saying that 424 was abrogated then?
No, I did not say that. Can you read out 424? I think if you read out.
I'll just read out the translation. Also, forbidden are women already married, except those slaves whom your right hand possess. So my understanding is, if those women are slaves, even if they are married, but if they're captured as slaves, you can have sex with them. Is that not correct understanding?
No, this is not the meaning of that verse. It says that illa ala azwajihim, which means aw ma malakat aymanuhum, that slave women that you have captured with which you already have. I mean, this does not relate to any new slave. It relates to slave women that men already had earlier on. So, as I said, immediately at the time of Battle of Badr, no new slave could have been made. So, all that this verse is referring is to women who had already been captured or bought in slave markets, and they were part of some household or the other. So, it's not referring to any new slave that could have been captured, because they had to be set free, or they had either through ransom or through without ransom. So 424 is speaking about women who are slaves, but they were already in one of the houses which the Sahaba or the people who were the followers of the Prophet already had. And for them, it was said that yes, you can have. You can be intimate with them, but that intimacy, as I said, was again something which was conditional, and it ended in near 8th or 9th Hijrah when that verse of Muqatibat actually was revealed.
So, okay, I think perhaps the problem is because slavery continued in the Islamic kingdom for such a long time, right up to the time of the Ottomans, that it just painted such a bleak picture, almost as if that it was allowed. So maybe that's
I think as far as the rightly guided caliphate was concerned, the first 40 years, you'll not find the Quran being violated in this regard. This violation, or this, I would say, a different understanding of the Quran only resulted after the Caliph Ali. Otherwise, in the first 30, 35 to 40 years, this directive of slavery, regarding slavery, and the fact that slaves cannot be captured was strictly adhered to. So I think we have done this exercise as well. You can read it in some of our articles, in which we have shown that the battles which took place in the times of the Sahaba as well, how this was strictly adhered, and especially in the times of Prophet Muhammad, how strictly this rule was adhered to. It was only later on when, because of a different understanding, that slavery continued to exist. And I think this is very similar to the case of democracy, or Amruhum Shura Bainahum, because we see that in the first 35, 40 years, the principle of Shura, or democracy, or the rule of the majority, or rule through consultation, was in vogue all through. It was only after, you very well know the history when Muawiyah and Yazid had that dispute, or Muawiyah and Yazid had that monarchy being established, that this came into being. So I think slavery and democracy in this way are two very similar things, which were followed for a certain period of time, and then a different understanding of both these directives came into being.
Thank you very much. Just one last point. Can you just give me the reference for that categorical imperative you mentioned, where Quran finally said to have no slaves? You mentioned that before.
I think
Sorry,
it's Surah Nur, verse Surah 24, and you just search for the words fakatibuhum. I think they should be near the middle or near the first half of the surah, or you can just search it through. So it says that you have to set them free if they give you this guarantee. It's somewhere in the middle or the first half of Surah Nur.
All right. Thank you for the clarification in your time.
Dr. Shehzad, I have one written question.
Right.
It's about an ayah from Surah Al-Imran, ayah number 28. It says, "Let not the believers take the disbelievers as friends instead of the believers, and whoever does that will never be helped by Allah in any way or shall have no relation with Allah. Allah frightens you of himself, his punishment." Okay, so here I have some friends, not only in my class, but from all over the world. Many Muslims have many friends who are non-believers. So do people commit sin by making a friend from the non-believers? Do I commit a sin by having them as friends? Please, your guidance is needed.
So this is one of the verses that has to be understood under the light of the Quranic law of messengerhood, in which these verses and verses of similar sort, they are actually related to the foremost and the direct addressees of Prophet Muhammad, the Jews and Christians of his times, to whom the truth had been delivered, and in spite of this direct communication and conclusive communication, they ended up denying the Prophet in one way or the other. So for them, the punishment was that such people who deny the Prophet out of outright deliberation, deliberate and intentionally, they would not be made friends. This verse has nothing to do with the Jews and Christians of today. Today, Jews and Christians or people of any other religion, they can be made friends, and any social relations that you have with Muslims on a very similar way, you can have the same social relations with them, of course, with the restriction that there are certain dietary restrictions that we have to follow. Other than that, this verse and some of the other verses which tell us that prohibition of, or communicated to us the prohibition of making friends with non-Muslims like Jews and Christians, as I said, are related to a very specific background, which I've explained on several occasions, that messengers of God, they convey the truth in its ultimate form on behalf of God. And once people deny them intentionally, and this intentional denial is something which God communicates to their messengers. So today, neither we have a messenger nor does God communicate whether someone is intentionally denying or not. So even if there are people today amongst non-Muslims who might be deliberately denying the Prophet or the Quran, even then, because of the fact that they cannot be pinpointed, because in the times of the messengers as well, the Almighty actually singled them out and said, well, such and such are the people. So today, these verses have to be understood that they relate to the foremost addressees, and they are part of a divine scheme which is in play in the times of messengers of God. And that scheme is that people who intentionally deny the truth are punished in this world, and their accountability is made a proof of that greater accountability that is going to take place in the hereafter.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. I hope this must have clarified it for the participant. That's the end of the questions that we have for Shehzad.
Okay, inshallah, we'll see each other tomorrow.